On poursuit dans le micro, ne pas oublier de parler dans le micro. Nous poursuivons et j'invite David Wacyk à me rejoindre. Nous avons la grande chance de recevoir ici David Wacyk. Il nous vient de loin, très loin, puisqu'il vient de l'université du Missouri à Saint-Louis, aux États-Unis d'Amérique. David a une grande spécialité, puisqu'il est docteur en art, et son doctorat porte sur l'œuvre d'Ida Gotkovsky, d'où sa nécessaire présence. Merci d'avoir fait le voyage, David. Technique.
Bonjour à tous. Je suis honoré de figurer parmi les distingués présentateurs et musiciens d'aujourd'hui. Je remercie l'Association Française pour l'essor des Ensembles avant pour sa généreuse invitation. Il est évident que mon expérience de la langue française est très limitée. Je vous prie de m'excuser pour ma mauvaise prononciation et j'admets que je dois m'exprimer en anglais. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I first became aware of Ida Gotkovsky in 2017. Until then, her music was largely unknown to American conductors of my generation. I felt this was an injustice to such an important 20th century composer and set out to write my dissertation to help bring her music to light in America. American conductors have fallen in love with 20th century French wind music, especially that of Olivier Messiaen. And so Mrs. Gotkovsky's influences are a topic of great interest to me and the growing American audience for this style of wind music. It is my privilege to share with you today a bit of my exploration. First, we'll take a closer look at her emotional and artistic connection to two of her more prominent teachers, Olivier Messiaen and Nadia Boulanger. Next, we'll survey her progression of style throughout her career. And then we'll consider her connection to her lineage and how it inspires her style. I will outline the basics of her compositional approach and will celebrate her work in more depth. In the midst of World War II, she entered the Paris Conservatory at 10, where she studied for 14 years. Among her teachers were Olivier Messiaen and the eminent pedagogue Nadia Boulanger. During her time as a student, she won numerous awards for excellence, including the namesake award for Nadia's sister, a prize that Gotkovsky held very dear. I'd like to just briefly share the teaching styles of these two as described by former students, as a basis for understanding Gotkovsky's musical upbringing and style. At the Conservatory, Messiaen was professor of harmony, analysis, and composition. Having spent many years teaching at the Paris Conservatory, countless young composers came under his tutelage. His teaching style fostered freedom of expression in his students. Although he did not want to dictate a compositional style, it was natural for his students to absorb aspects of his style or even specific traits of the composer's process. In a survey of Messiaen's teaching style, Vincent Benité remarks, while Messiaen did not force his students to believe in what he believed in, often preferring to remain silent, he did influence them as a composer nevertheless. Through his teaching, indeed his pedagogy was not connected to the super-compositional outlook of some ideal composer, but to Messiaen himself. Additionally, Benita explains, Messiaen consistently strove to stir the imaginations of his students. They, in turn, were often inspired to explore and discuss his ideas outside of his class. Although Gotkovsky, like many of Messiaen's students, Boulez, Xenakis, and Stockhausen, to name a few, has a musical style that is uniquely her own, Messiaen directly influenced many of her compositional techniques, mostly having to do with rhythm and harmonic direction. We'll explore that later. Nadia Boulanger taught at the Paris Conservatory after World War II. Like Messiaen, Boulanger was interested in developing the personal traits of her students, which would allow their individuality to drive their compositions. She was ruthless towards this end, however, making sure her students knew their compositional roots and often compared a student's score to earlier masters, urging them to find a more interesting path. Boulanger remarked, I can't provide anyone with inventiveness, nor can I take it away. I can simply provide the liberty to read, to listen, to see, to understand. The American composer Ned Rorem suggested that Boulanger held women to a higher standard in her class than her male counterparts. He states, she would always give the benefit of the doubt to her male students while overtaxing the females. Despite this elevated scrutiny, or perhaps because of it, Gotkovsky appears to have developed a lasting personal connection to Boulanger. This is evident in a series of letters sent from Gotkovsky to her teacher over a 21-year period from 1957 to 1978, currently housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. These letters, mostly day-to-day in nature, provide evidence of the women's mutual admiration, primarily in the form of invitations and attendance to each other's concerts. They also show a relationship beyond Gotkovsky's conservatory years, in her requests for advice and meetings. One letter, written in October of 1963, illustrates their warm yet formal student-teacher relationship, as well as Gotkovsky's emotional openness with Boulanger and her humble nature. In her salutation, she writes, Your insightful kindness is dear to my heart and fills me with joy, for I doubt myself a lot. Pardon me, dear mademoiselle, for writing these words so directly, and please believe in my very deep and affectionate admiration. Because of her time at the Paris Conservatory and due to her musical lineage, her style emerged in the 1970s as decidedly French, and proponents of her music noticed this. She quickly became a popular ambassador of French music as she traveled abroad, including to the US, for the premiere of her Poème de Feu. Despite some obviously misogynistic views, journalists and critics were impressed with Gotkovsky's musical style, and which they viewed as a departure from her outer appearance. As an introverted composer, she described herself as a homebody content to spend her time in nature, specifically in the forests surrounding her village. Gotkovsky says she prefers to compose in solitude and in silence. Music, she says, is a thinking noise, and away from the piano as much as possible in order to engage her mind's ear as a compositional tool. The result of her efforts is a large body of works for all genres. This includes over 22 published works for wind orchestra from throughout her career. Her writing for music for winds began in the mid-1950s and continues today. Her largest output emerged during the 1980s and 90s, corresponding to the increased access to academic and civic bands during this time. Considering the breadth of Gotkovsky's career, it is reasonable to acknowledge that her works for wind orchestra exhibit some points of change as they progress from the mid-20th century to the early 21st century. Gotkovsky's propensity for the older styles, musical styles, is evident in her work. Early in her career, the titles of her works, such as concerto, symphony, and sonata, suggest her more absolute outlook, like Baroque and classical styles. In later works, she turns to tone poems with titles suggesting more organic, archaic subject matter, Poème de Feu and Auret Lumière. Throughout her career, ritualistic undertones, including imagery of paganism and the Christian church, pervade Gotkovsky's works. This influence of ancient music can be found more obviously in her later titles, but also through melodic analysis of her earlier works. For example, her concerto reveals elements of plain chant, ritual dance, and celebrations of the natural world. In general, Gotkovsky's music shifts from chromaticism to a more broadly accessible tonal and modal style as the years progress. Even with these shifts in her style over the course of her long career, Gotkovsky has infused her music with energy and vitality, and in general, her overall style retains consistency. So next we'll explore the composer's musical DNA and elucidate the common characteristics of her style throughout her career with a bit more listening. In her musical credo, Gotkovsky declares her intention to create a universal work and to use a contemporary language with powerful structures to ensure the unity of musical expression throughout all time. She goes on to describe her desire to express the infinite in her music. This is often expressed through various compositional techniques, including overlapping music and a sense of never-ending musical material. In general, her music is primarily dissonant, heavy, and dramatic. As a result of, and by contrast to this ever-present intensity, she's able to amplify moments of incredible sensitivity and delicacy in her music when it occurs. As stated, she often draws inspiration from old or ancient musical styles, including both religious and pagan ritual, while incorporating these into classical forms. During the first half of her career, her works are all drawn out, long, and typically challenging for collegiate ensembles, though not at all unapproachable. As time progresses, her works become easier and shorter as she turns her attention to amateur ensembles. She also favors a unique two-movement form for many of her pieces. The depth and breadth or weightiness of her music might seem overpowering, but the emotional heaviness is balanced by her more austere harmonic and formal structures. Understanding her work from an analytical point of view can help clarify her complex language. My approach has been a practical one as a conductor, and so this is the standpoint from which I approach her music. My process includes using Gotkovsky's musical credo, here it is again, to investigate her treatment of pitch, rhythm, and texture, and how these create or affect form. The following is a very brief outline of these elements, starting with pitch and with plenty of listening examples, so here we go. Like many of her French predecessors, Gotkovsky's musical vocabulary is dependent on a rich combination of pitch systems. Her melodic content is generated largely from Messiaen's modes of limited transposition, as well as most scale types other than major. I will not presume to describe all the details of modes of limited transposition to you here today, but there are certain important properties worth discussing as they pertain to Gotkovsky's use of these modes. Mode 1 is recognized as the whole tone scale and has 2 possible transpositions. Mode 2 is the octatonic scale and has 3 possible transpositions. These, as well as modes 4, 5, and 6, can be considered truncated forms of modes 3 and 7. In other words, modes 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 are constructed from modes 3 and 7. These 2 modes of limited transposition can also create traditional modal scales, so-called church modes. And the combination of any 2 transpositions of modes 3 or 7 can produce all 12 pitches of the chromatic scale. Of all modes, 3 and 7 house the largest collections of notes and therefore lend themselves to the greatest variety of possibilities. Gotkovsky appears to be keenly aware of this and makes full use of Messiaen's modes and their permutations. Gotkovsky's clever use of Messiaen's modes is notable. She primarily uses the modes to move between symmetrical and asymmetrical systems. She uses symmetrical systems for unsettled music, such as chromatic, octatonic, whole tone, and modes of limited transposition, and asymmetrical systems, such as modal, tonal, and pentatonic, for settled or directional music. She will often use several of these different systems simultaneously or in frequent succession. We can hear this in the second movement of her Concerto for Wind Orchestra, as she freely moves between whole tone and modal pitch systems. So I'm sure by now you've noticed, you already know this probably, that Gotkovsky's harmonic language is very often dissonant and non-functional. This dissonance is largely due to her use of several pitch systems, either all at once or in close succession. For instance, she often moves between two modes of limited transposition, which again will produce all 12 pitches. So her chromaticism is intended but designed in a way that sounds incidental as it emerges from the interaction of two voices, with different modes or different pitch systems. We can hear this in the opening of the first movement of Gotkovsky's Spring Symphony. She often relies on prolonged sections of static harmony while developments in texture and color propel the music forward. This technique is a direct descendant of Messiaen's chords of resonance, which he suggests can provide an image of stained glass when set as different inversions above a pedal tone. Here, we can hear this technique during the ending of the first movement of her Concerto for Wind Orchestra. Let's listen to this music with the brass producing the static harmony, which develops ever so slightly, while the woodwinds create texture through arpeggios of the same harmony. Finally, she often moves between unfocused and focused harmonies. For unfocused harmonies, she uses symmetrical pitch systems, often many at the same time, and her focused harmony uses one asymmetrical system. This is similar to Messiaen's approach to harmony, as we can hear in this excerpt of Messiaen's Tarangalila. In Gotkovsky's music, we can hear this movement of unfocused harmony to focused harmony in a beautiful arrival moment in the third movement of her saxophone concerto. In Gotkovsky's music, come on. Yes. Her approach to pitch has a direct effect on texture, so we'll listen to this first. The texture of Gotkovsky's music is dense and can feel like it's constantly polyphonic. We see this across her body of works, like here, here, and here. Again, we can identify a similarity with her teacher's style. Messiaen will often use simultaneity in his music, at times even to amplify the shift to more singular music. We see this in many of his works, including Oiseau Exotique. And Gotkovsky has taken on this trait. We can see this in her writing as well. But a hierarchy of voices helps to discern importance and sift through this density. In this hierarchy of texture, generally, slow-moving voices carry the dominant melodic content, while other busier voices play a supporting role with contrasting pitch systems. She clarifies some of this agitation through what I call interwoven textures. For instance, take a look at this page from her Concerto for Winds. We heard this just a few moments ago. We can see the busyness of the inner voices. Conductors, however, will quickly realize that this busyness is really just a textural harmonic effect, similar to Paul Hindemith's writing. And the true melodic content exists in the slowest moving lines. Compounding this rhythmic complexity, though, is the fact that this material employs a contrasting set of pitches, further complicating things. And yet, Gotkovsky has a way of weaving several voices and their contrasting pitch systems together with vertical collections that interrupt the busyness of the plural pitch systems, all while providing stability through a solid harmonic rhythm. Notice, too, that at moments of interruption, the pitch collections align. Also, her dense polyphony, like Messiaen, is effectively clarified through her use of rhythm. Her music is very rhythmic and includes many techniques from Messiaen's toolbox, including non-retrogradable rhythm, added value, augmentation, and polyrhythm. These aspects of her music are clear and easy to identify in her scores and perhaps do not need to be discussed at length this morning. But in this way, we can see how Gotkovsky intertwines her own rhythmic sensibilities with those of her teacher. However, I do wish to draw your attention to an aspect of rhythm that is notable, as it highlights Gotkovsky's personal signature use of rhythm as it pertains to her credo. We see Gotkovsky's approach to the universal and timeless elements of her credo worked out a bit through her use of rhythm. Ritual and spiritual aspects of the human experience have influenced Gotkovsky's music. This is reflected in many of her rhythms which evoke ritualistic dances. In some of her works, she alludes to dance style from the Western tradition, as in the waltz-like style of her danse rituelle. More often, though, the dance rhythms she uses are characterized by syncopation and asymmetrical note groupings, suggesting a more rustic or ancient style. Examples of these rhythms can be seen in most of her works, including her Poème de Feu, and her Spring Symphony. Finally, let's see how all of these elements, pitch, texture, and rhythm, combine to create Gotkovsky's formal structures. On the surface, or upon first hearing, Gotkovsky's formal structures appear to be unclear. Curiously, her music seems simultaneously moment form and completely sectional, while at the same time through composed and completely continuous. This is due in part to the frequent change of textures about every 10 measures, while retaining a sense of continuity through motivic relationship and sectional overlapping or elision. The effect of this is the wonderful duality of her work, a constant sense of forward movement, anticipation, and development, even in moments of stasis. Remarkably, though, through analysis of pitch, texture, and rhythm, I was surprised to find clear formal structure in her music, including the presence of traditional forms. Here's a diagram outlining the first movement of her Concerto for Wind Orchestra. I won't go into much detail here, but I will highlight just a few points of interest which are exemplary of her overall formal style. First, sectional elision is a major aspect of continuity in Gotkovsky's forms. A new section begins well before the previous section has ended. Next, big arrival moments might seem to occur at random points in her broad musical forms, but there is a method to these arrival moments. Within a typical musical section, she includes an initial presentation of a theme, mode, or pitch class set, followed by a long development, leading to a brief but powerful presentation of the altered theme. I think of these as structural columns, powerful culminations of musical material which function as formal supports connecting major sections of the piece. The golden mean also marks important moments in most of her musical forms. Finally, notice that the sections, which seem to shift rapidly, combine to create a three-part form, with elements suggesting sonata-like structure. Musically, this really works well, but it's not always easy to discover how it works. Here's one example of this motivic continuity before we finish up. Notice an interesting technique that occurs with the main chant-like motive in this movement. Like a normal sonata form, the main theme from the opening returns at the end. But here we see how Gotkovsky's approach to pitch, rhythm, and texture affects her formal structures. In the final statement, we hear the chant in its traditional or modal form in the upper voices, whereas the opening version uses the same contour but substitutes pitches of the third mode of limited transposition in the lower voice. Let's listen to these melodies in that order. So this is just one example of the way she manipulates similar material to form recognizable yet fresh sounds as the music progresses through its very long form. This is also a perfect example of Ida Gotkovsky's stylistic approach, blending Messiaen's harmonic language with her own. This is appropriate since we know that Nadia Boulanger would never have been satisfied with Ida's compositions as mere carbon copies of Messiaen's style. Indeed, Boulanger's influence must have directed Gotkovsky toward using Messiaen's compositional tools to create something new and unique to Ida, while retaining a quintessential French style and sound. Congratulations, Madame Gotkovsky, for leading such an inspired life and career, and thank you for your music, as we are all the beneficiaries of your beautiful work. Merci encore pour l'invitation à partager avec vous aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup.
Merveilleux exposé, non? Formidable. Stand-by. Peut-être avez-vous quelques questions autour de l'œuvre d'Ida dans sa composition, dans ce qui regarde le travail de David, qui, je crois, nous permet de rentrer dans cet atelier du musicien. Cette influence ou non-influence, parce que je ne sais pas, Damien, tu pourras traduire peut-être à haute voix pour David. Je suis incompétent en anglais, je vous préviens tout de suite. À titre personnel, j'ai souvenir d'avoir entendu souvent Ida dire qu'elle n'avait pas du tout subi d'influence de la part d'Olivier Messiaen. Pas du tout. Elle le refuse. Et pourtant, Voilà. Alors Damien, tu peux traduire peut-être
Yes, what Patrick now just mentioned is that obviously Ida had no or did not use the influence of Messiaen, but you did say the contrary. And also me, I had some allusions of Ida Gotkovsky to Messiaen. So I think there was a certain influence, and you also mentioned it. Patrick said there is that. D'où est-ce que tu as cette information, Patrick?
C'est-à-dire d'Ida elle-même.
Oui, mais elle a beaucoup dit de choses qui ne sont pas vraies, n'est-ce pas, et qui ont été après prouvées qu'elles étaient.
C'est son opinion sur sa musique.
Oui,
voilà,
oui.
Voilà.
Yes, Ida said that she didn't use influence on Messiaen, but Ida says a lot of things that at the end of the day, are not the reality.
And I think many composers, at some point in their career, wish to distance themselves from those that might have had a direct influence, especially if both Messiaen and Boulanger had this expectation that their students would go off and create something unique to themselves. Even if there was an inherent display of similarity between the two composers, I think she would, in the way she describes her own music, want to distance herself from that. I think in hindsight, many decades later, as some young, inexperienced conductor looking at a score, I have a little bit more freedom to say, they don't sound the same, I don't think. And even last night during conversation at dinner, my companion next to me mentioned there are no birds in her music, right? So how could it be influenced by Messiaen? And I think that's a good example. It's not going to sound like Messiaen, but I think, especially from an American conductor's standpoint and an American audience, French music sounds very distinctive. And so I think we have, as an American, I might have maybe undeveloped, but maybe a unique perspective to say, there's some similarities here between these two composers and these two styles, even though there's quite a bit of difference in the way they might sound. I'm not a theoretician, but I love music theory and I love harmony. And so for me to figure out, again, I had to conduct this music, so I needed to look at this whole score and try to figure out why it works the way it does. And the result of rather than look for similarities, the result of my work, spending time with this music, naturally I was able to see these similarities and compare them, mainly with technique, not necessarily the sound. Although I do think that the prolonged moments of stasis, where the harmony just stays, the image of stained glass, I think is a good example. That to me is the most profound similarity with Messiaen. Even though there are no birds, I think with Messiaen, he would create 5 minutes of just cacophony. Nothing changes. It's just the same music for 5 minutes. And I think Ida's very long musical works sort of show that as well in the stasis of harmony.
Des questions. Je crois qu'il y avait un micro. Voilà. C'est-à-dire que c'est pour l'enregistrement. Voilà. Il est bien d'avoir le son. Yes. Jean-Pierre Pommier.
Bonjour et merci. Est-ce que la musique d'Ida Gotkovsky a influencé des compositeurs américains? Non, pas en anglais.
The question is if Ida Gotkovsky did make an influence on American composer.
That's a good question. I think that she would have. She came in the 1970s to the United States several times, one of which was to premiere Poème de Feu, which was written for CBDNA, which is the College Band Directors National Association in America. And so I think in the 1970s, there was a genuine interest in her music. She toured and was in residence at Michigan State University and also in Texas. And I think there was excitement about her compositional style, which was really new during that time. However, I think in America, at the end of the 1970s into the 1980s and 1990s, American conductors took a turn towards a very different musical style in band. And I think probably because band music became more accessible to young students in schools, and Ida Gotkovsky's music was not playable by young audiences, young performers. I also think that an injustice was done to Ida, at least in the United States. Because she was a woman, there was a little bit of prejudice against her, I believe, in the United States, which is why I wanted to write this paper and to speak about Ida. And I think those two things together made American composers and conductors shift their focus towards a different style of band music for education purposes. However, I will say, I know that the Marine Band, the United States Marine Band, the President's Own, has continued to perform her music. And in the last 5 or 6 years, she's become very popular in the United States. And I think we'll start to see the influence on younger composers that want to sound like her.
Je peux permettre de traduire un tout petit peu la réponse. En fait, l'idée de sa réponse, c'est qu'elle a été jouée donc, pour le Poème du Feu aux États-Unis, mais que probablement, en fait, elle n'a pas vraiment fait école à cause de la difficulté d'exécution de ses pièces, puisque aux États-Unis, en fait, le mouvement des orchestres d'harmonie est beaucoup basé sur les universités et des orchestres qui n'avaient pas le niveau, en fait, probablement de jouer cette musique. Et que la deuxième raison, c'était peut-être c'est lui qui le dit, une forme de misogynie, en fait, parce que le fait que c'était une femme, et que dans ces années 70 et 80, en fait, c'était pas facile, c'était un monde d'hommes. Et peut-être que depuis quelques années, les orchestres professionnels américains se réintéressent de plus en plus à cette musique.
Merci.
Autre intervention, question, envie d'échange, c'est le moment. Ce serait le bon moment même. Damien avec le micro. Et Damien, si tu le peux, en français et traduit. Merci.
Je vais essayer. Yes, I have a question. You mentioned the aspect of through-composed melodies. And I know the expression, of course, from Richard Wagner, who introduced this idea of through-composed melody in his, yes, we cannot call it opera, but music dramas. Wagner's music dramas last 5 hours. Now, my question is, how can you speak of a through-composed melody in a piece of 10 or 20 minutes? Voilà. Je ne sais pas comment traduire le terme through-composed. Composé dans une sans structure, une mélodie qui dure, et cet aspect ou cette technique a été inventée par Richard Wagner, n'est-ce pas? Et il l'a appliqué pour ses opéras ou pour ces drames musicaux qui ont une durée de 5 heures. Maintenant, ma question est comment est-ce qu'on peut parler d'une mélodie sous-composée pour une pièce qui dure 10 à 20 minutes?
Oui. Yeah, I think that her music is not through composed, but I think as an audience member, if you just listen to the music, I think she creates a lot of variation in her melodies, and I think it can present the image of a through composed piece, even though it's only 10 or 20 minutes long. The term through composed, the way I might approach it today for these purposes, is more, maybe it's an extreme word, but I think that it might mean formless, without form. But in fact, there is form in her music. I just think that it takes a little bit of investigation to find it. A good example is the end of that first movement of her large concerto for wind orchestra, which is basically sonata form, A, B, A. But the two A's don't always match because she substitutes a different pitch system. And so I think that's a way that she's able to create this sort of never-ending music, always moving music, as opposed to section, 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 by creating that constant change in the way that she writes her music. Even in shorter forms, Or et Lumière, it sort of just moves from a conductor standpoint and from a listener. It's always beautiful to listen to, and so you don't care that it doesn't feel sectional. It just feels like 10 minutes of music. So that's what I'm getting at, I think, with that statement.
Nous avons encore un petit moment, si vous le souhaitez, voilà, de questions, d'échanges.
Oui.
Oui. Alors aussi, à titre personnel, là il faudrait aussi traduire, excusez-moi. À titre personnel, j'aurais une question sur alors l'influence de Messiaen, très bien. Beaucoup plus compliqué, semble-t-il, pour évoquer une influence de Mademoiselle dans l'œuvre compositionnelle, j'entends bien. J'ai le sentiment, et les courriers dont tu as parlé, David, qui sont des courriers aujourd'hui consultables à la Bibliothèque nationale de France, courrier d'échange entre Ida et son professeur. C'est très intéressant parce que c'est très ponctuel. C'est merci de m'avoir invité à la messe à Saint-Sulpice, merci de ceci, merci. Et on sent très bien le rapport maître-élève, mais on ne sent pas l'influence, quoi. On sent vraiment une forme de domination peut-être, je ne sais pas comment dire les choses. Moi j'ai ce sentiment, je ne sais pas ce que tu en penses et j'aimerais bien que tu me dises ce que tu penses de ce rapport assez particulier avec Nadia Boulanger. Voilà.
Maintenant que tu m'as eu, est-ce que tu peux formuler la question dans une phrase, dans une courte phrase?
L'influence avec Nadia Boulanger, les rapports Nadia Boulanger, Ida Gotkovsky, comment David, qui a travaillé sur ces rapports-là aussi, comment peut-il les qualifier, ces rapports?
How can you qualify the link between Ida Gotkovsky and Nadia Boulanger? Is it more a formal one, or is it also a friendship between both, between a teacher or professor and pupil or student?
I think that's hard for me to answer, although I tried just now in my presentation. But I think that given the distance in decades between now, what I am aware of now, and 60 years ago, but also between an American sensibility between teacher and student and whatever a French sensibility would have been 60 years ago. I think it's somewhat difficult for me to say what their personal connection was, but it was a thrill to find 10 letters at the library here in France between the two, and actually they're only from Ida to Nadia Boulanger. We don't have the letters from Nadia Boulanger to Ida. She probably does. So based on those letters, it appears that their connection was close. I would have to compare other writings from her or from her other students to her. Of course, we have that might be a future paper because there is lots of evidence. She had so many students, and so it's hard to say that hers was a special connection. But we can at least see from these letters that they had a lasting connection. And I think that it's safe to say that Ida Gotkovsky never lost her admiration for Nadia, and that it must have been a positive learning experience for Ida going forward. And I think she must have felt that she had license to find her own voice in her compositions. But as we saw in the one letter that I had as an example, she continued to doubt herself and relied on her teachers to help her continue to write in her own voice. Beyond that, I think musically, if you listen to some of Nadia Boulanger's organ music, I think there are some striking similarities, but I would have to spend more time to analyze the similarities.
Je dois traduire tout.
L'idée.
L'idée est qu'il y avait toujours un étroit lien entre Nadia et Ida, parce qu'elle, si j'ai bien compris, elle voyait quand même Nadia voyait quand même le talent dans Ida, mais avec la distance de 60 ans, maintenant, David dit qu'il est plus ou moins difficile d'apprécier ou d'évaluer cette liaison, mais ça sera peut-être le sujet d'une autre conférence, n'est-ce pas?
Oui, peut-être aussi à renvoyer à David une idée qui me traversait l'esprit. On parle beaucoup, on reparle beaucoup de l'œuvre justement de Nadia Boulanger, parce qu'on l'a un peu oublié, et on a oublié son influence sur de très nombreux compositeurs, pas seulement français. Justement, c'est très particulier, parce que ces ateliers Boulanger sont des ateliers ouverts sur le monde, avec des gens qui viennent du monde entier, notamment des États-Unis. Mais je pense à Bernstein, mais je pense aussi à Caralosa, etc. J'avais été très surpris lorsque nous avions fait une conférence ensemble, Damien, de l'omniprésence du nom de Nadia Boulanger pour des compositeurs pour Ensemble avant, qui sont américains, qui sont européens. Et en revanche, il ne semble pas, et c'est là où je voudrais que David me dise ce qu'il a trouvé, lui, sur ce sujet, il ne semble pas que Nadia fasse partie de ce qu'on appelle la boulangerie, c'est-à-dire ces fameux cours que Nadia Boulanger donnait en dehors du conservatoire. Il semble que les liens ne soient que les liens dans le conservatoire de Paris, où Nadia Boulanger faisait des classes d'accompagnement. On ne voit pas, moi je n'ai pas trouvé trace, c'est ça qui m'intéresse en tant que musicologue, je ne trouve pas trace d'autres choses, c'est-à-dire ces fameux cours de Nadia Boulanger qui étaient donnés chez elle, qui était une institution et qu'elle a donné jusqu'à un âge très 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 avancé. Voilà, alors l'idée donc, l'histoire de la boulangerie, ce qu'on appelle la boulangerie, les adeptes de Nadia Boulanger.
Comme la Schubertiade.
C'est ça, voilà.
Oui.
Donc, voilà.
Bon, si j'ai bien compris, if I understood well, Patrick says that first that the influence of Nadia Boulanger, that was the first point, is becoming more important nowadays. Second point is that Boulangerie influence outside of her formal courses at the conservatoire are not so important than her courses as a professor at the Paris Conservatoire.
And Nadia Boulanger is very infamous in America because of her attachment, connection to higher profile composers such as Copland and Bernstein. And I think that an American audience sometimes doesn't know or forgets that she was a professor, not just an influencer, as she may have been when she was in New York.
What's with her younger sister Lily, who died very early? She also was a very talented composer, and nobody knows if she would have been older, what would have been the influence of Lily. Perhaps a more important one than that of, but this is speculation, of course.
Sure, and I think that Nadia would have said the same thing. And I will add that there may be some personal connection to Lily as well from Ida Gotkovsky. They may have been closer in age. What we know from letters is that Ida felt a deep connection to Lily Boulanger, but we don't know the extent of that.
But did both women meet? Because I think that Lily, she died at a very, very early age. When did she die?
1980.
Yeah, so
she
too early.
died in 1980.
Yeah,
so
too early.
They couldn't. Yeah,
But I think that having won the Lily Boulanger Prize, I think Ida Gotkovsky always felt a deep connection in that way to Nadia, and so I think it's I think it's interesting, and I'm not sure what other information there is.
Do we know if Ida followed the studies in Nadia Boulanger's home, at home, or only in the conservatory in piano accompaniment lessons? Do we know this?
Do we know if they met outside of the conservatory? Is that what you're asking? Yep. It appears that they did to some extent, again, based only on the letters that we have from Ida Gotkovsky to Nadia, that they continued to talk and discuss, primarily regarding Ida Gotkovsky's work as she continued to write music, but also, I think, primarily in the more formal personal invitations to each other's concerts. As far as instruction outside of the conservatory, I don't know.
Thank you. Je sais, parce que je l'ai vu dans le fond Nadia et Lily Boulanger, qui en fait a été récupéré par le CNSM de Lyon, qu'on peut consulter là-bas, que pour répondre à ce que tu disais sur l'œuvre de Nadia Boulanger, qui est beaucoup moins conséquente que celle de Lily, bien que Lily soit morte très très jeune. En fait, j'avais vu que lorsque Bernstein était directeur musical de New York Philharmonic Orchestra, Nadia était venue diriger le New York Philharmonic Orchestra uniquement sur les œuvres de sa sœur, parce qu'en fait, elle a passé sa vie à défendre le répertoire de sa sœur. Et il y a ça dans les archives du fonds Nadia et Lily Boulanger au CNSM de Lyon. Et juste pour information, on dit toujours que Lily Boulanger a été la première femme à obtenir le prix de Rome en 1918. Et en fait, c'est pas tout à fait exact. Enfin, c'est vrai que c'était la première femme, mais c'est un premier prix de Rome qu'elle a eu ex aequo avec Claude Delvincourt, qui était le directeur du conservatoire ici, pour sa cantate Faust et Hélène. Et ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est que Lily Boulanger était déjà malade et que Claude Delvincourt a aidé Lily Boulanger à finir l'orchestration de sa cantate. Et je pense que c'est aussi peut-être l'une des raisons pour lesquelles le prix a été partagé aux deux. Ouais, enfin, bon.
Est-ce que tu peux résumer
Tu résumes pour moi, Jérôme?
Well, just Philippe said about Nadia and Lily that apparently Nadia Boulanger was guest invited by Leonard Bernstein to conduct the New York Philharmonic on Lily Boulanger's music. And the other stories about his Lily's Boulanger Grand Prix de Rome, that she was already sick, and Claude Delvincourt, that had to join first prize with her, helped her for orchestration the cantate.
Yeah, and I will also add, this is maybe a personal interpretation of their relationship, but I think that we know from interviews from the French press with Ida Gotkovsky, she seems to always have to defend herself as a woman. She was sort of always on defense. Not that she was attacked, but she sort of was. There was scrutiny because she was a woman, and the press wanted to know, how can you write such powerful music when you're so small, and so in her discussions with reporters, she always had this sort of rough exterior in some ways. I think to see in letters to Nadia Boulanger that she was able to let her guard down and say, I doubt myself, thank you for your input. I think that might show a little bit of that warmth between the two of them compared to how she had to present herself to the public.
Juste pour résumer, c'est l'idée qu'il y avait un contraste chez Ida Gotkovsky qui semblait, c'était une petite femme fragile, mais qui avait l'air très sûre d'elle en fait, en public et dans les interviews, et que peut-être dans sa relation avec Nadia Boulanger, dans ses écrits, elle se permettait en fait de faire part de certains doutes qu'elle avait, ce qu'elle ne faisait pas par ailleurs.
Il n'est pas ouvert, donc je l'ouvre. On s'en tient là et on fait... Ah pardon, une question de Jean-Pierre, vas-y.
Yes,
I
am going to try to speak English.
Yes.
Merci.
Encouragez-moi. I propose you a little exercise. Could you tell us with only three words, to qualify the music of Ida Gotkovsky? Only three words, please.
Trois.
In French.
I have to leave. Powerful, intimate, and beautiful.